I'm really excited to be here, and thank you guys so much for inviting me. So this is going to be quick. So a little bit about my story, and let me see. So I am happily married to Dr. Charles Anderson, who is here helping, so thank you very much, and we have a son, Mark. We actually don't live very far from here. And I was born in Guyana, the Caribbean. I grew up in Barbados, and I have a twin brother who both of us actually went to elementary school in Guyana together. And so we had the same access to the opportunities, the same activities, the same friends, et cetera, et cetera. When we moved to Barbados, I went to an all-girls school, he went to an all-boys school. You can switch the slide. And what happened there, and I want to tell you that these illustrations are compliments of one of your classmates, or high school mates anyway, Alexander Wright. I don't know if he's here. But, so this is artwork by Alexander. So I went to this all-girls school. It was almost like I was on a school bus, which is an all-girls school bus that was physics owned, that was no physics, and the all-boys bus where my brother went to school that had access to physics. And I had decided pretty early on that I wanted to be a doctor. And what happened was that in order to be a doctor, I needed to take physics, and it wasn't available at the all-girls school. Next slide. So what I did was raise my hand and said, or just keep clicking through. Essentially, you can think about the bus as stopping at multiple bus stops, and the girl just didn't have the bus stops that I wanted. The girl bus stops were nurses, manager, homemakers, secretaries, and the boys bus had the physicist, the mathematician, they had the scientists, the engineers, and they were stopping at the bus stops that I actually was more interested in. So what I did, next slide, was I raised my hand and I said, listen up, keep going. And I said, hey, there's something that I want to do that I don't have access to as a girl, and can somebody do something about this? And the good news about the culture and the environment in which I was educated was that they actually had the prime priority as education. And because they wanted to see me succeed, what happened, keep going, was that I then was allowed to leave the all-girls school and switch over to the all-boys school. Now, the girls who had gone to the school that I was at, everyone was content, everyone was happy, they knew what they knew, and they just didn't know that it was an option to take physics elsewhere. And so some of those girls went on to be doctors and scientists and mathematicians, but you can almost look at this illustration and kind of see the disadvantage, which is that the girl was on the bike and she was pedaling furiously, expending all of this energy while the boys were in the bus heading to the destination. And so it wasn't that it was impossible, but it was so much harder. And so many girls, by the time they got to the destination, were actually really, really tired and then never went on to further scientific careers. So I got on the all-boys bus, and next slide. And what that meant was that I then was able, by my very presence, by my raising my hand and saying there's something that's not right, by asking the question, by actually challenging a system that just presumably didn't really know better, I was able, next slide, to then provide opportunities for other girls, next slide, to then have access to that all-boys school. So it just speaks to the importance of whenever you see something that just doesn't quite add up, just raise your hand, ask the question. And many times, people in the system will actually make a way for things to actually affect change. So that then kind of instilled in me this desire in how do I actually, number one, survive in an environment that is completely foreign, where as the only girl, as you can imagine, it was a very, very different type of experience for me. And I actually developed what I call these 5 habits of positivity, which first one is if there's a problem, you just believe that there's a solution. So you feel empowered around whatever difficulty you encounter, you know that there's a solution of some sort. The second habit is if there is a challenge, any limit that you encounter, you can believe that, you know what, it's actually an opportunity for you to convert it into something that either makes you more resourceful, more innovative, motivates you more, it challenges you. And so you can turn any bad situation into something that allows you to gain some leverage. And that kind of gives you this empowered frame of mind and mindset. The third habit is that we're all going to encounter positive and negative things. That how do you actually create a framework where you don't hold on to the negatives? It doesn't mean that life isn't going to be hard. It doesn't mean that things aren't going to be up and down, but basically, are you going to hold on to those things and allow them to weigh you down, or are you going to take the time to process them, to put them in the right boxes, and to continue to try to accumulate the positive things that will encourage you? The fourth habit is that we are all here for a purpose. And as a surgeon, I knew that I was called to be a doctor. And my belief is that we're all here to make a difference in someone else's life. And that means that if you believe that no matter what your circumstance, no matter where you're from, no matter what you look like, that you're actually placed here with a specific, unique purpose, then it gives you that extra kind of, drive to know that nothing can stop you. And then the fifth is that really operating from this place of gratitude, being thankful instead of me focusing on the fact that, oh, there are all these boys and they're so different from me and we have all these different ways of interacting, some of which were negative. Focus on the fact that I actually had the opportunity, that I had teachers and a system that really supported me, that even though this was something that was different, they recognized that I was blazing a trail and they wanted to be a part of my success. And so I was thankful for that. And so fast forward, I finished physics, I finished high school, and I went on to Johns Hopkins University. Now this particular slide, as I was kind of going through all of the different changes and the challenges of being in an all-boy environment, part of what really sort of helped me to know that I could do it was that my parents kind of, if we think about ourselves as these treasure chests where people are constantly putting in positive things, and if anyone puts something negative, you curate it, you audit it, you get rid of the negative, that it really kind of sets up this construct about what do you believe, what are your values, and then your values then, kind of inform what you think about, and then what you think about actually informs your actions, and your actions then go right back into that treasure chest to continue to kind of fuel the fact that that positive reinforcement, when you do something good that makes a difference, it makes you feel good, which then informs what you believe, which comes back to then what you care about, which comes back to what you do. So I went to Hopkins Medical School with this treasure chest full of, next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Keep going. So all of these are the things that I care about. Girls in STEM, lack of diversity in children's books, overall negativity in our environment, creating positive role models for our kids, healing, teaching, encouraging kids to understand what we have in common and not focus on our differences. Next slide. So I go to Hopkins and I have this treasure chest with all of this stuff incredibly full. Like, I am really believing that I am going to Johns Hopkins University as a biophysics major in order to prepare to go to medical school. And the first day that I got there, the first week, I met with the pre-med advisor, because at that time, having come from Guyana and Barbados, I was an international student, and we had a little bit more challenges getting into medical school. So what she said to me was that you're not going to get into an American medical school, so you should plan to go back to the Caribbean in order to pursue medicine. And that's many times, whether you're a girl, whether you're a brown person, whether you're short, whether you're tall, whether people look at our external and they make decisions about what we're capable of and what we can do. And so essentially what she was in effect doing, she was kind of dumping all of this negativity into my treasure chest. But because I had been trained and raised in an environment where I had been supported and I had been affirmed, and people had been very clear about, you can do it, you can make a difference, you can be whatever you want to be, I was able to actively take that garbage out, dump it into the trash, and find another advisor. And so I left Johns Hopkins, next slide, I left Johns Hopkins, next slide, heading on to Harvard for medical school, and decided at that time, medical school is one of those places where you are able to do lots of different rotations. So you have this opportunity to see all of the different types of specialties and subspecialties in medicine. You get the kind of chance to sort of understand what really speaks to you. And from very early, I knew that I wanted to be a surgeon. I loved being in the operating room. I loved using my hands. I'm actually kind of impatient, and so being able to see a problem, kind of address it, and then move on to the next thing really sort of appealed to me. And I loved the anatomy. I loved just the feeling of having my hands inside of someone's body. And so what I realized about medicine is that it's actually a real intersection between the art and the science. It's the science, which is the technical part, but it's also how do you care and relate for the patients. You can click forward. And so because my belief system was about making a difference and caring for others, these are the actions that I took. Became a surgeon, became an educator, volunteered to give back to the community, became active in the community. Next slide. And what, as a urologist, and unfortunately I don't have a pointer, but just because this is a STEM talk and I want you to understand what I do as a urologist. So as a urologist, I am in charge of the surgical aspects of the genitourinary system, which means this is a system that makes pee. If we don't make our urine, which is one of the main ways in which we get rid of waste products, then we are essentially going to die. So the genitourinary system starts, if in the middle you see the kidneys, the urine, the bladder, and then the genitalia. The urethra in women run through into the vagina, and in males it runs through the length of the penis. And so here we are with the genitourinary tract. Now, what are some of the things that as a urologist I deal with? I deal with things like bladder cancer. So many types of cancers of the kidneys and the bladder. So anywhere along that tract, you can expect that there can be a cancer of some sort. So we can see cancers of the kidney, and as you see up here, cancers in the upper pole. Here in the bladder, when you look on the inside of the bladder actually looks like the inside of your mouth. It's kind of that pink soft tissue. And the great thing about being a urologic surgeon is that there's so many different ways to enter the body. If there's an orifice in your body, it means that usually as a physician, we can access that. So we access the bladder by going in through the urethra. So we don't always have to make an incision to cut to get into the body. We can go through those natural openings. So in the urethra, we do a lot of endoscopic surgery where we can go into the bladder and we can deal with different types of issues in the bladder, in the ureter, and even up to the kidney. This stone right here, we do a lot of stone work. I don't know many of you, and unfortunately I know we're short on time, so I'm not going to ask questions about how many of you have known someone who've had a kidney stone, but stones are just those things that develop because our urine is like a salt solution, and if you get dehydrated, it crystallizes and it precipitates as if you boil a pot of salt water on the stove and it forms those little crystals. The urine has the same exact effect if you are not well hydrated. And so what happens is you deposit these little kidneys in the stone, in these little crystals in the kidney or the bladder, what you will result with these stones. And over time, the stones can get quite large. If any of you have ever heard of someone who's passed a stone, it's actually really, really painful. And so this stone right here, this is actually a pretty big stone. You see, it's almost 4 centimeters. This stone came out of someone's bladder. And this is someone who could not, obviously you can't pee out a 4 centimeter stone. And this is for you gentlemen and for you young men who are going to grow into older men. You have a prostate. And I'm sure you've heard about prostate cancer, but the prostate is a little gland that sits at the base of the bladder, and it encapsulates, it encircles the urethra. And so as the prostate enlarges, which will ultimately happen as you get older, sometimes it becomes more difficult for you to force the urine out. You end up retaining urine. And when you retain urine, it means it's like a stagnant pool in the bladder. And what that means is that you will then have, these crystals precipitating, and then these type of stones form. So that, as you can imagine, is a pretty painful situation. So now the other thing that I deal with, so up at the very top, you will see that that's a stone in the ureter. And the cool thing about, as I already said, about urologic surgery is that I take a small telescope which goes in through the urethra into the bladder, and then it snakes up the little tube towards the kidney. And so any stones that are in the kidney or the ureter, I can actually apply a laser to break those stones up. So it's almost like playing a video game, and it's really, really quite fun trying to chase off these little pieces and then basketing them and removing them. So that's the ureter. Now, I know this is probably a little gross, but this is the pelvic. So this picture right here with the hooks, that's a female who, what happens in our pelvic floor, we have muscles that hold the bladder, it holds the rectum, it holds all of these things up. It's kind of like a hammock. And over time, especially if women who've had children, you never probably think about what happens when you have to push a baby out during delivery. But what you're really doing is stretching out all of the muscles of the pelvic floor, and they're like a piece of elastic, so they will kind of go back down to their original kind of length. But over time, with hormonal changes, things can stretch, and then structures start dropping. So, you know, you may have a woman who may feel like a ball coming out of the vagina, that's the bladder falling out. And so I, as a urologist, will fix those things, those types of things. And you can imagine, even though it seems funny to you, you could imagine that as a patient who's walking around with something falling out between your legs. Now for guys, you can have hernias that do the same thing, and so you can walk around with your testicles huge because you've either had a hernia or you have a hydrocele, which is like it's filled up with fluid. But either way, as you can well imagine, if you can just put yourself in that person's shoe for just a moment, it is super uncomfortable. So I actually would be the person that makes you feel better and that operates on those things to help them go away. Now, what are some of the emergencies that happen in urologic surgery? So here is a picture of one of the things that we also do in urology is bladder replacement. So for instance, if you have bladder cancer and it is so advanced that we cannot cure it by just resecting it out the way that I showed you, just kind of that little small tumor in the bladder. With that tumor, we can just insert an instrument and kind of cut it out with an electrical loop. Tumors that are much more advanced, we have to actually remove the entire bladder. And our bladder is essentially the reservoir that holds the urine and before we urinate it out. So if you remove the bladder, we now need to create a substitute for the bladder, or else we need to create what we call a conduit, which is that we now connect these ureters. So you see the bladder, right, that round structure in the middle, and where the ureters plug in. We can either make a new bladder with a piece of intestine and then connect it to the urethra to try to have you urinate normally, or we can attach the ureters to a small segment of intestine. So we'll take a small segment of the small intestine, we'll cut that out, we'll attach the ureters to that segment on the one side, and then the other side we'll bring up to the abdomen in a little stoma that's attached to a bag. And I'm sure some of you might have seen or know people who have a little bag on the abdomen, which is where either their stool dumps into if they have a colostomy because the large intestines need to be removed, or for bladder purposes, we kind of redirect the urine to that small intestine. So the reason I give you that backdrop is that sometimes when we do that, we have to make an incision in order to get into the inside to remove the bladder and to sort of reconfigure the whole urinary tract. And in that incision, we close that incision back with staples or with sutures, and there are times, for whatever reason, when that incision splits apart. And when the incision splits apart, what you end up having is the intestines kind of bulging onto the abdomen. And that's kind of a surgical emergency. So this patient was not my patient, but I got called in the middle of the night because the intestines were eviscerating, meaning coming out onto the abdomen. The incision had broken down. And I was the one that now had to come in and fix that and kind of, create some bigger sutures to hold it together. Next slide. So that's kind of just a broad overview of what I do with the urologic center. So this, just to add a little bit of a little context. So even though, and I want you guys to listen, I want you all to listen very carefully. So I'm a urologic surgeon. I don't do anything with feet, right? However, when I talk about the art of medicine and the importance of thinking about the patient and how the patient feels and the patient as a whole, what happened, this patient came in the middle of the night with a surgical emergency, urologic emergency. I operated on that patient, but what I noticed, it was a patient from the nursing home, and this is what the feet looked like when they got into my operating room. And so after I had done my surgery, I could not possibly let that patient go back to that nursing home with their feet looking like that. So what I did is I washed the feet and then dried it off, and I did not cut the nails because that was a little much. It was not kind of my area because I didn't really know. They should see a podiatrist. You don't know what some of the implications are of trying to cut the nails. But I cared enough about the patient, and I saw the patient as more than just a urologic problem. I also saw this other part of that patient that needed to be addressed and to be cared for. Next slide. So to that end, this is the good stuff. To that end, I wanted, based on my experiences and based on the fact that as a woman in urologic surgery, as a very, very small percentage of people in urologic surgery who look like me, I wanted to empower girls, kids of color, everyone to have a positive attitude, next slide, and to believe that there are no limits. So I created this girl surgeon. She's all of these things on the inside: kind, caring, powerful, positive, etc., etc. Next slide. And essentially, she has these habits of positivity that we already talked about. Next slide. And this is the series of books. And essentially, the overall message for you guys today is that you're going to encounter challenges. Women in STEM, we are working tirelessly to continue to improve representation by creating role models, by creating messages that empower you. But this is not just a message for women and for girls in STEM, because ultimately we work together in an ecosystem. And so if I just focus on girls and empowering girls, it means that the message for boys about being open-minded, about understanding that we're all valuable, your mindset never changes in terms of what are some of the negative stereotypes and beliefs that you apply to, whether it's girls, to yourself, to people of color. We have to educate everyone, and we have to create, this construct and this understanding that we're all in this together, that we all bring value together, and that if we can create these messages from very, very early, then we create a world with a much better experience for all of us. And that's the short run through, and I don't know if there's time for one or two questions, but that's my life as a urologic surgeon, as an author, and as a catalyst for positivity.